common language. Yes, we do. But don't take my word for it, folks. This is absolutely amazing. The first evidence we see that we, in fact, had a unified language at one point, folks, is called the linguistic evidence. Now, Ed, that's not an Italian food, although it sounds like it. If really we're talking about language here is what's going on. Let's take a look at the hardcore evidence, folks. Due to the advances in the study of languages, or what's called philology, say that 5 times real fast. I couldn't do it either. Anyway, so here's what it is. We now know, folks, they know that all languages can be traced back to what researchers themselves, folks, have called the mother tongue. One such researcher is a guy named Max Muller, who's one of the world's top language experts. And he taught at Oxford University, and in his book, Science of Language, last time I checked, Oxford University is not some biased Christian college. In his book, folks, Science of Language, here's what he wrote. He says, we have examined all possible forms which language can assume, and we now ask, can we reconcile the admission of one common origin of human speech? I answer decidedly, the world's top expert. Yeah. Gee, like the Bible's right after all. But that's not all. Dr. Harold Siggers, he had this. Though there are countless languages and dialects, approximately 3,000 currently known, continued studies have revealed that there must be a common ancestor. But that's still all. Dutch scholar Jared Alders, he's talking about a famous Assyriologist, and here's what he discovered. He said he made an amazing discovery that there is a clear relationship between the languages of the native people in Central and South America, and some of the islands, and the ancient Sumerians, the oldest known language, and even the Egyptian languages. And this scholar, who had formerly considered the account of Genesis 11 to be nothing but a goofball myth, he said, quote, came to the conclusion that the biblical narrative is much more credible than to have been suppose. But that's still all. Let's throw in some modern technology. Check it out, folks. There are the modern day linguistic scientists who are, we'll use computers. They solve everything. And we're going to put all these languages in there. We're going to see if, in fact, what does it spit out. And here's what they found, folks, with the various languages. Based on what they discovered, one researcher said this. It's a direct quote. Maybe the Bible's right. And there really was a Tower of Babel. Or at least maybe there really was once a single human language before we were all cursed with the confusion of tongues. That's interesting. But folks, that's the tip of the iceberg. Now let's take a look at the oriental evidence. Wow, hidden within the Chinese language. This is really cool. According to the Harvard Chinese-Japanese Library, written Chinese dates back to approximately 2500 BC. It's one of the earliest languages, okay? And if you do the math, folks, that 2500 BC is just about pretty close to the time of the end of the flood. Okay, and the point being is that, well, that's when all languages, if the Bible's right, would have its origin, right? Well, folks, get this. What's amazing about the Chinese language, it's not just pictorial. It really hasn't changed much over time. And oddly enough, when you start looking at it, folks, the Chinese picture words speak about Noah's flood, one of the earliest languages. Let's take a look at a few Chinese words. You tell me if this is interesting. The Chinese word for boat just happens to be depicted by 8 mouths, or 8 people inside of a container. How many people were inside the ark? Hey, that's kind of interesting. Is that a quinky-dink? I don't know, Tom. The Chinese word for total is the uniting of 8 people who join hands over the earth. How many people survived the flood? Only 8 people at that time were left alive to start all over. The word for empty in Chinese is made up of 2 words, cave and work. Cave is depicted by not 5, not 3, not 100, 8 people under one roof. Some would say that this shows that when Noah and his family left the ark, they first moved into a cave for shelter, hence 8 people under a roof. And then they left the cave each day to work at emptying the ark. And then they shared this post-flood experience with future generations, which eventually made its way into the Chinese language. Oh, but that's not all, folks. And this is not all of them, by the way. I'm just going to give you some of the highlights. The Chinese character word for devil just happens to be from 3 other characters: a man, a garden, and a private setting. Genesis chapter 3. Hey, the words rebellion and confusion in China, together the words are made up of tongue and walking. When the people rebelled, God confused the tongues and sent them walking. We'll read the text here in just a little bit. Is this just you may start to see a little quinky-dink going on here? And finally, folks, the word for garden or field in Chinese is a square, and inside the square are 4 straight lines radiating outward like in a plus sign, a square with a plus in the middle. Well, it just so happens, according to Genesis 2, a river in the Garden of Eden flowed outward into 4 streams and watered the entire garden. I don't know, Deb, maybe it's just me, and I'm brainwashed. But I'm kind of thinking that's more than a mere coinky-dinky. Right? I'm kind of thinking, Mike, based on the evidence there from languages, that's not just interesting. I would say based on the hardcore facts and the data that God's left behind for us, He's given us the clues, He's given us a trail, He didn't have to, that the evidences from these languages prove, folks, there really was a worldwide flood. And I would add this note, folks. If you ignore this evidence on purpose, then maybe it's because you're scoffing like the Bible said you would in the last days. And you are choosing to be willingly ignorant because you don't want there to be a God who judges his creation. Interesting. But we're just getting started, folks. The second evidence that shows us there was, in fact, a global catastrophe is the evidence of lineage. Okay, the evidence of lineage of mankind, how we started, the nations in the world. Let's take a look again at the text. This is what happened after the Tower of Babel. Let's read the rest of the text. Genesis chapter 11, verse 5 through 9 says, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. And the Lord said, if as one people speak in the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they do is going to be impossible for them. So come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord what? He scattered them from there. Now, where's there? That's the Tower of Babel, right? Right next to Babylon. Okay? He scattered them from there over the earth, and they stopped building the city. And that's why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. He says it twice for emphasis. From there the Lord scattered them over the what? The face of the earth. Folks, according to our text, it's pretty obvious. It says right here, once again, right after mankind rebelled, what did God have to do? He once again had to intervene in man's rebellion, and this time he confused their languages, right? Now here's the point. What did that confusion of the languages cause mankind to do? To do what in the world God said to do in the first place? You need to get out there, get scattered, and repopulate the earth, right? And so that's the obvious question. Do we see any sign of mankind not just having one language, but do we see any kind of evidence, folks, of mankind having one single point of origin and then scattering across the face of the earth? Isn't that a logical question? Absolutely. And folks, the first evidence that we see is the evidence from history. Okay? And this is what's so absolutely amazing. You talk about specifics. The Bible didn't just say they got scattered from around here. The Bible throws in a double whammy effect, I call it. And they said it specifically happened in the days of a guy named Peleg. Give it up for Peleg. Let's take a look at this text. This is what's so important to read this. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25 and 32. 2 sons were born to Eber. And one's name was what? Peleg, okay? And why? Because in his time the earth was what? The earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And these are the clans of whose? Noah's son, direct descendants of the flood, according to the lines of descents from within their nations. From these nations, the nations, what? They spread out over the earth after the flood. Right? So this is what's amazing, folks. According to our text, it isn't just that the nations scattered out, but the Bible throws in a double assuredness there that it specifically happened in the time of this Peleg guy, a direct descendant of Noah. So that's the logical question. Not just do we see any of the nations scattering forth, but do we see any evidence of the nations scattering forth specifically within the lifetime of this guy named Peleg? Of course, folks. But let's, again, not take my word for it. Let's look at the evidence of history. Now, for those of you hooked on math, first of all, the biblical dating puts the flood about 2349, 2348 BC. Okay, so if you continue to do the math with the genealogy, that puts the birth of this Peleg guy about 2247, or about 100 years later after the flood. Okay, so let's start doing some math. Here's what's interesting. The historical evidence shows, folks, it was precisely during this time that we see the nations of the earth not just springing forth from a single source right next to the Tower of Babel, but just like the Bible states, they begin spreading out from a single source, specifically in the time of this Peleg guy. Let's take a look. The first nation to be founded was Babylon. Based on the historical evidence of the Chaldeans, folks, the nation of Babylon, which is right next to the Tower of Babel, okay, was founded first in 2234 BC, or about 13 years after the birth of this Peleg guy. The next nation to be founded was Egypt. From another piece of evidence, folks, we discover that Egypt was founded about 2188 BC, a little further away and down south, about 60 years after the birth of this Peleg guy. And then we have the founding of Greece. According to the historian Eusebius, folks, Greece was founded about 2089 BC, further now to the west, okay, about 160 years after the birth of the Peleg. Now, you put all the facts together, folks, and here's what you get. Notice how all three nations were founded. Major nations in our world, folks, were founded relatively within a short time frame of each other, right? And they just happen to be speaking a completely different language? That's kind of interesting. But that's not all, folks. You do the math, and here's what you notice. Babylon was founded first, which was the closest to the original point of origin. Egypt was founded second, which was a little further away from the point of origin. And finally, Greece was third, which is still away from the point of origin, exactly within the lifetime of this guy named Peleg. That's kind of interesting, but that's still not all, folks, what we should find. How about the biological evidence, okay? Here's the whole point with this. One logical thing we should expect to find, folks, if there was indeed a worldwide flood, is not just a single point of origin. We just saw that. They know that. Mankind came specifically from that area. We should find a single parent of origin, right? Stop and think about it. And the reason why is because according to the Bible, if it's true,